Psalm 10 is a continuation of Psalm 9. They are both acrostics, and they fit together as Psalm 10 continues the alphabetic psalm that Psalm 9 began. Psalm 10 is primarily a lament, and so we again look at our psalm through the lens of a lament. We see the terms of address. Notice that the only time that the generic name for God, Elohim, is used is when his name is on the lips of the wicked. But when the psalmist is addressing God, he addresses him as Yahweh, or Lord. The first half of the psalm is entirely lament, as we have a very vivid description of the wicked person who is tormenting the psalmist and the poor in society. Second half of the psalm, again, terms of address, O Lord, our God, O God, in verse 12, is the call to prayer. Arise, lift up your hand, and forget not. That's the request. Here is the lament again, the complaint in verse 13. Why? The questioning. Why does the wicked renounce God and say there's no judgment? And verse 10 is our first return to confidence that God does see and does help the helpless. Again, a prayer in verse 15, an imprecation, a curse upon the wicked, and then a concluding statement of confidence that Lord is king forever and ever, and he will do justice. Zooming in on the poetry and the language, we see in the very first verse the classic statement of a lament. Why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself? Where are you, God? In essence. So while Psalm 9 was largely a focus on the God who judges, Psalm 10 is a focus on the recipient of God's judgment, the wicked person or the wicked oppressors in society. There's a vivid description of them that they are ones who hotly pursue. In other words, this is active, this is intentional, this is planned as they pursue and take advantage of the poor. In verse 3, the wicked boasts of the desires of his soul. So there is no humility. There is no shame. There is pride in their sin. They parade their sin and boast of it. There's no confession or recognition of wrongdoing here. They're motivated by greed. They're greedy for gain. They curse and they renounce the Lord. So they're motivated by selfishness and personal gain. We can note similarities here to a couple of other psalms, Psalm 14 and Psalm 53, its counterpart. These two psalms, 14 and 53, are largely identical, and we have very similar language here that the wicked person is convinced that there's no accountability. There is no judgment. There is no God who will call them to account, and they are totally autonomous, free to do whatever they want, because God will never call them to account. That underlies all that they do. Their words are highlighted in verse 7, filled with cursing, deceit, oppression, mischief, iniquity. And then finally we have a picture of the wicked. It is a metaphor of a lion. So apex predator in the ancient world, preying even on humans, particularly the weak, the vulnerable. And we have a lengthy description here of the wicked person becoming like an animal in terms of how it hunts the innocent. We see a lot of references in this psalm to the poor, the innocent, the helpless. I've highlighted those throughout in purple. Even more references here than we had in Psalm 9. Moving to the second half, we have God described in human terms as lifting up his hand to help, it might seem, and also to strike. So those are the two aspects of God's judgment: to lift up and to help the poor, and then to lift your hand to break the arm of the wicked. Again, highlighting the terms of the oppressed in this context. In the Old Testament, there were four groups that God seems to have particular concern for. The marginalized in society were the fatherless, that is the orphan, the widow, the foreigner and the stranger, and the poor. And two of those groups are highlighted here, in particular the orphans and the poor. We have an imprecation in verse 15 that God would break the arm of the wicked and call them to account completely till there are no more that are to be judged. And then another anthropomorphism, that God would strengthen the heart of the afflicted and incline his ear towards their prayer. so that God would do justice. And by justice, we mean these two things. We mean punishing the wicked, and we mean, secondly, caring for the oppressed and seeing that they are treated fairly, so that man who is of the earth may terrify it no more. We might note the contrast to the previous psalm, Psalm 8, where it described the role of human beings to care for the earth, to cause human flourishing. And here in Psalms 9 and 10, we have the opposite of that, that man who was meant to rule the earth in a positive way has instead become a terror to the earth. This is a Psalm of David, and we noted with Psalm 9 that this is a communal lament. This is not personal. David doesn't seem to have an individual in mind here, but rather societal evil, oppressive systems, perhaps. So there's not a personal element here. The psalm has a lot to say about the nature of human beings, or what we would say anthropology. And we see that pride is accented in verses 4 and 5, that the tendency of humans is to say, hey, there's no judgment, there's no accountability, I can do whatever I want. It makes us think of the lie of the tempter in the garden in Genesis 3. You'll become like gods. And so that's the underlying sin of all humanity, is that of pride. And we also observe in verses 8 and 9, just as the wicked person is personified as a lion, less than human. So this is what happens if we give in to pride and selfishness, is that we become less than what God has made us to be. We become dehumanized. We treat one another like animals. We become animal-like in our consumption and destruction of others for selfish gain. We see in the last half of the psalm, God's justice is expressed both as punitive. We see that in verse 14, that God does note the mischief and vexation, and he takes it into his hands. He does something with it. He responds, and that at the same time, he also helps the helpless, the fatherless. He is the helper. His hand does both things. It smacks down the guilty, and it lifts up the victims, both punitive and restorative. Beautiful picture of that in this psalm. Now, taking a look at these two psalms, which are actually one psalm by structure, they are an acrostic together. But you do see a bit of differences between the two. Psalm 9 focuses on the poor, on the victims who are oppressed by the nations. We might see this as societal injustice or systemic injustice. Psalm 10 focuses on the wicked, on the perpetrators, on the victimizers who will ultimately be judged. And this then is placed in contrast with the previous psalm, Psalm 8, which presents this glorified picture of mankind created by God, declared to be made in the image of God with the purpose of ruling and causing the earth to flourish. And when mankind rejects his origin, his identity, his purpose, and his destiny, he becomes a terrorist. It's the opposite of what God intended. So I believe that Psalms 9 and 10 were placed right after Psalm 8 to create a very clear contrast. Psalm 8 is the world as it's meant to be, with mankind understanding who they are and what their purpose is on earth. Psalm 9 and 10 says this is what the world looks like when man rejects God, when he rejects his origin, his identity, and his purpose, and he becomes animal-like in its treatment of one another, and the world becomes an awful, horrible place rather than the glorious place that reflects the majesty of God that Psalm 8 describes. Moving to the New Testament, we see that Paul quotes this psalm in Romans 3:14 in his list of verses that describe the depravity of man. It reminds us that even as we might look at this psalm and go, wow, I'm thankful that I'm not like the wicked person that's described here. Well, Paul says, no, actually this is every one of us. This is a description of all of us. Verse 9 reminds us of the metaphor that the New Testament uses of the ultimate adversary, Satan. He is described to be a roaring lion. There are two animals that Satan is typified by, and that is of a lion for its power, for its destructiveness, for its lethality, and the snake for its slyness, and also its destructiveness, its poisonous. So this metaphor is picked up in the New Testament. When we think of Jesus, this psalm comes to mind as well. Jesus, we've referenced this with Psalm 9 as well, that Jesus quotes in his sermon in the town of Nazareth, his hometown. He quotes Isaiah 61, and he quotes most of this, but he leaves off the very last phrase. Jesus says, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, that God has not forgotten the afflicted." And Jesus goes on to say, "He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And in Luke's account, Jesus stops right there and he says, "I tell you, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." But what about that last phrase, "and the day of vengeance of our God"? I believe that day was yet to come. That day would be fulfilled on Calvary. And when Jesus took the vengeance, the wrath of God for all the sins of humanity, he took those himself upon himself on the cross. God's wrath was poured out on Jesus. Vengeance for all this evil that had been done previous and after the cross as well would be poured out upon Jesus. That was the day of the vengeance of our God. And so it's a reminder that Jesus, for our sake, became poor. He who is rich, God himself, became one of us, became poor, so that by his poverty we might become rich. Krieghauser states it this way in his commentary, that Christ is both the poor, that is, he experienced trampling by the wicked, ultimately in his death on the cross, but Jesus is also the victorious judge, the one before whom the nations and every human being will stand. He is the victorious conqueror. He is both the poor and he is the judge. He is both the Redeemer and the ruler of all. And so these Psalms 9 and 10 present that glorious picture of Christ as the poor, as well as the one who vindicates the poor. As we come to the application of the psalm, I think it's important to realize that it's very easy for us to point the finger at others and say, "God, I thank you that I'm not like them." We can be very pharisaical, and we can look at the world and say, "God, I thank you that I'm not a sinner like those pagans over there." Paul reminds us, no, all of us have fallen sin and fall short of the glory of God. And sometimes we rationalize our sin ourselves by saying, "Well, God will never see. He'll never know. I can get away with this in secret." In fact, that's specifically what happens here. The psalmist says that this person in hiding places murders the innocent, that he thinks no one will ever see, no one will ever know. So when we indulge in pornography, destructive of human beings, and we say, no one will ever see, I'm doing this in secret. No, God knows, and God knows that that activity has consequences on the innocent. That theme continues in the second half of the psalm, where wickedness tends to operate under the radar in secret, but God will call an account. God will do justice. And the very last verse reminds us that our job is to do what Jesus has already begun, and to do justice to the fatherless and the oppressed, and to restore man to his glorious position on this earth.